I'm going to cover a quick reminder of what's changed under the General Data Protection, that should say regulation, not programme, from the Data Protection Act. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be accountable. This is a new principle in the data protection regulation, and it seems to sort of pass quite a few people by. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and also quite specifically about some of the policies and processes that you might need to think about. Permissions and consent. I know some of you have probably seen the ICO's, I'm going to say, helpful guidance on consent that came out. Sometimes I think it's more confusing. That came out a week or so ago. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. A little bit about profiling and how you share your data with the Alliance. A little bit about security, and then some things that you might consider in addressing your GDPR programme. So if you don't want to listen to that, you can do your emails now. So my first point is keep calm and carry on. Don't panic. Why do I say that? Well, I'm hoping that most of you are already compliant to the Data Protection Act, aren't you? And also to the Privacy and Electronic Communication Regulation, PECA, which governs how you send out emails and how you send out or do SMSs and phone calls. So when I say all this regulation does is update that those two, one of those regulations, the Data Protection Act, and it brings it into the 21st century. Data Protection Act, about 20 years old, about time it was updated. And then there's also this other thing that they're doing at the same time, or they're trying to introduce at the same time, and that's called e-privacy directive, sometimes termed PECA 2, but that's updating the electronic aspect of the regulation, and again trying to govern some of the over-the-top players like Google and WhatsApp and Facebook. So, first point, keep calm, carry on. Why? Well, actually, and again, something to Lara's point early on, actually, if you're doing the right thing already, then you already, hopefully, have got consumers trusting how you use their data. This is a survey that our sister organisation, Data IQ, did last year about why it's important to be clear about what you're doing with people's data. And the fact that actually consumers, and actually you'll see how this updated in grey for 2017, how actually consumers are quite happy to share their data if they trust the organisation that they're sharing that data with, and that's important. And then the second point is also important, and that they're happy to share if they explain the rationale about that. Lots of people talk about the value exchange. So again, remember that. And then there are still a lot of people who are preferring not to share unless they have to. Actually, that number seems to have decreased a little bit. I think last time a survey was done was at about the time of the TalkTalk scandal. So that could have had an impact on that. But like I say, there's a lot of consumers who are quite happy to share data if you explain why and if they trust you as an organisation. And then the other thing that we found when we did this survey with the Data IQ team was actually consumers are still quite largely ignorant about this particular regulation. Quite a lot of them haven't really heard very much about it at all. So I think there is an onus on us as responsible marketeers to educate them as best we can. So I'm going to talk very briefly about what's new under GDPR. I've got 2 slides, okay? And the bit in pink is what is new. So the bit that's not in pink is actually pretty much the current Data Protection Act, which is why I say if you're all compliant to that, which I'm sure you all are, then you have nothing to worry about. So the first bit, which I do want to just spend a couple of seconds on, is about transparency. So always there's been this requirement to fairly and lawfully process data. Add this bit that you need to make it transparent now. And actually the Information Commissioner, Elizabeth Denham, is very keen on the word transparency. So again, perhaps worth remembering that about being completely clear and honest about how you're using the data. And then, as you can see, all these other bits and pieces about explicit purposes and so on. I don't want to labour those. I'm happy to talk about those in the workshop sessions. And then there are some things which are new. Hurrah! Some new things that have arisen as a result of this regulation. And the first point is about stricter conditions for consent or permission to use the data. And it has to be, that consent has to be given in a clear and unambiguous way and requires a positive opt-in. So no more pre-ticked boxes, no more confusing statements. And again, the ICO, as I said, has issued their draft guidance about this. I actually spent quite a lot of time reading the Abacus guidance that was given. I think it's all on your chairs. I would seriously encourage you to read this and start applying this, because I did have a look at some of the members in the Alliance and what was said on some of their statements, and I'm not sure it kind of will pass muster, but this is excellent. So I would strongly encourage you, I wish I'd written it, but I didn't, but anyway, I'd strongly encourage you to read it and apply it. And then, of course, there are other things about maintaining records of processing. I think you're hearing from Nikki this afternoon on some ways that you can record how you're getting your consents, wider subject access requests, and then my favourite new one is about the controller, that's you, shall be responsible for and able to demonstrate compliance. So this is the accountability principle. I won't go on about the fines. I think they've been talked about enough. So, I think you are probably the lucky ones. Firstly, because direct marketing has been recognised as a legitimate business interest under GDPR. Of course, they don't actually define what direct marketing is, and I think it was kind of testament to the Direct Marketing Association that they managed to lobby to get that in. I think direct marketing is most definitely direct mail. And the reason I say that is that the PECA regulation, which I mentioned earlier on, and the e-privacy directive, which I also mentioned, covers other forms of communication. So if you're doing email marketing, you're doing phone-based marketing, text-based marketing, programmatics, all the sort of ad serving, that's all going to be covered under the e-privacy directive, which, in case I forgot to say, is also coming out at the same time. But if you're just doing post, I think you're fine. It is a legitimate business interest. And again, this is all in your own guidance, so you can process personal data for direct mail purposes as it's in the interests of the business and the consumer. And I think, as I say, do have a look at the guidance and the wording in the Alliance's document, because it is also about the requirement to be able to object to some of the processing of that data. So I do think this goes back to the whole point about transparency and being able to say, actually, I'm happy for this data to be shared because, back to the whole value exchange, I'm going to get communication by post from other mailers who I think are going to be interested in what I have to say. So that's good. But you still have, but you still shoot the messenger, you still have other accountabilities. It's not all about consent. This is a bit highbrow, apologies. But I really like this definition of accountability, because it's not only what we do, but it's also what we don't do, for which we are accountable. And I do think that has resonance, actually, because, as I say, listening to the Information Commissioner, as I have done on many occasions in the last few months, and also I've talked to her about how she is going to triage in the event of a data breach actually happening. She talks quite a lot about and have you been accountable? So what does that mean in GDPR speak? Well, that's covered. I'm going to speak now in Article 5, Section 2. It requires you to demonstrate that you comply with the principles. So remember the 6 bullet points that I had at the beginning with all those bits of pink? Those are the 6 principles, and also with this new accountability principle. If she is coming after you, she's going to be asking, well, how accountable have you been? And they're very helpful, actually, at the ICO, sometimes. These are the things that they say you must do in order to demonstrate that you are being accountable. So, implement appropriate technical and organisational measures. And you think, what does that mean? Well, they even go on to explain what does that mean. So make sure you have policies in place around how you're protecting consumer data. And these may include staff training. So this is quite an interesting point, actually, because the GDPR covers employee data. It's not all about customer and prospect data. In fact, we have a client who 95% of their data subject access requests are from employees. So do you think about employees? And they call out, as I say, staff training, internal audits of processing, and reviews of internal HR policies. Maintain documentation, and where appropriate, appoint a data protection officer. There's a load of verbiage about what a data protection officer needs to be, have, qualifications, and so on. Again, if you want more info on that, do come and have a chat to me. Any of you who've done any of the ISOs, anyone done 9001 or 27001? If you've done any of those standards, you'll know the difference between must and shoulds. So these are the musts from an information commissioner perspective. And again, they're quite obsessed about you getting data protection into your DNA, really, so by design and by default. And so they talk about not having too much data, pseudonymizing the data, transparency I've mentioned, very important, allowing individuals to monitor their processing. So I don't want my data to be processed for this purpose, but I'm happy for it to be processed for that. Sounds a bit like a sort of gardening program, doesn't it? Creating and improving security features on an ongoing basis. So again, make sure you've looked at how the data is transferring between your organisation and third parties, and using impact assessments where appropriate. So that's a bit of blah blah about the regulation itself and some of the key things that you need to take into consideration. I've got a few slides about starting a program. I'm guessing that quite a lot of you have already started your program. So hopefully some of the things I'll say are good, because I'll kind of validate what you've already been doing, and maybe there's a few things that you think, oh, better add that in. This is a risk-based regulation. So again, think about it when it's actually in terms of the risks for the consumer data not being protected, because this whole regulation actually elevates personal data to a basic human right. So it's right up there. So if it feels a bit creepy, then it probably isn't right in terms of what you might be doing with that data. But it's all about managing risks. So the first thing, if you haven't done this already, is map your data flows. Know where your data is, what systems it's on. If you've got pet names for that, that's fine. Think about it from also the HR data, because I say that is also covered under this regulation. Sketch it out if you haven't done that already, because that will help you in the event of any subject access request. Documentation, I know that's really dull, but it does call out the requirement to be quite clear about what data you have, how you're processing it, how you're keeping it, and all of your records. So lots of articles about, the purpose of the processing, your responsibility, and so on. But do think about documentation. I'm not expecting you to read all of this. That's why I said my slides are available. I can send this to you. But this is a list that we've pulled together of the sort of documentation that you will need to have. So remember, going forward, the information commissioners, they're not given the funding anymore from us all registering with them. And also, data subjects can request what you know about them without having to pay the 10 quid that they currently have to pay. So I suspect you'll see quite a lot more people ask, what data do you have about me? And that's why I've put together this kind of checklist, really, because it does help you demonstrate that you are being accountable because you've written it all down. At the top of that list is the requirement for a data protection policy. Again, I suspect you've all probably got one of those. I'd just make sure you update it to ensure it covers this whole accountability policy. Sort of starts to fall down a bit when you get to data retention, not the same as protection. So, and again, the ICO is becoming quite bothered by how long people are holding on to data for. So remember going back to that whole, did I hold on to it for longer than was necessary? So do consider the legal or even business justification for holding on to data for too long. And you might consider shoving that into some kind of schedule. So this data for this long with this business justification. This data for this long for this business justification. And we're often asked, well, how long is justification? And that's a really hard question to answer. But if they haven't been a customer of yours for, I don't know, 5, 10 years, and that's not the cycle of, the buying cycle for your product, then I suspect that you can't really say that they are a customer of yours. Again, I'm not expecting you to be able to read all of the grid here, but it's again something you can have, which is basically a means of recording how you're processing that data and where you're sending that data to. Is it going outside of the European Union? If so, have they got the safeguards that they need in order for that data to leave European shores? You will most certainly need to update your privacy policy. And I think it's important, again, it's in the Alliance's guidance. It's really important that you reference what you're doing with the data in terms of profiling that data. I was saying to Lara early on, the new guidance says that third parties must be named. You can't even just put categories. You need to name them. Categories are not enough, so there might need to be another link there. I did say don't shoot the messenger, so I was with such a downbeat presentation here. I'll try and upbeat it. So when you've done all of that, brilliant, because you're doing a lot of that anyway, aren't you? Do think about staff training. So again, when the Information Commissioner comes a-knocking, if you have sadly managed to lose or misuse consumer data, they will ask quite early on in their triage process, did you train staff? Can you demonstrate that you trained the staff on what they ought to be doing with consumer data? And you can make these programs quite fun. Actually, we're working with an agency, a big agency group, who've become very specific about the messages. This is some online training. In fact, we're working with Rosemary on this one. Comet Relief, who did a whole data awareness week in terms of what they wanted to do and explain to the rest of the group why protecting and securing donors' data is really important. Data security pops up quite a bit within the regulation, and in particular it calls out some ways in which you can secure the data. So it talks about pseudonymization or hashing or masking of data and the encryption of personal data. And I'll just say a couple of words about encryption, because again, even now, so this is kind of like, don't worry, even now the Information Commissioner is very hot on encryption. These are a couple of examples of fines that have been levied for organisations where data has been lost and it wasn't encrypted. Encryption is really easy. So if you're not encrypting data when you're sending it out to your, whether it's your ESP, with your mailing house, your third parties, then you really do need to. So you won't have much sympathy if you don't. And I've talked a little bit about the importance of security. I'm a big fan of this standard, 27001, because a lot of the controls or things that you're supposed to do in ISO 27001 map really well onto GDPR. There are something like 114 controls or things that you need to do in ISO, and it maps really nicely to a lot of the articles which are in the regulation. And again, when new, because I think there's a new standard or a seal that comes out sometime, who knows when, and I suspect that, again, getting this privacy seal, you may need to have been able to demonstrate that you've already got some good security measures in place. And then, of course, happen. So make sure that you have a good data breach notification plan. Make sure you've, I call it like a fire drill, really, that you've stress tested this, that you've seen how your organisation will respond in the event of a data breach happening, whether that's, the common scenario of losing a laptop, data going to the wrong place, data being sent where it shouldn't have gone. Make sure you've got that fire drill in place. Make sure you've got someone in point as your spokesperson who knows what they're talking about, and make sure that your marketing communications team are also on point. We've got lots of tips and helpful guidance. It's all free. It's either available on our website or on our sister organisation. Again, I've done a list of practical tips and action points. The ICO have their own 12-point plan. French have gone one better and have reduced it to 6. And never mind about the French. I've gone and given just some tips here. Again, I'm not expecting you to read all of these. So 3 key takeaways from me. There is a new principle in town. It's called the accountability principle, and it's worth remembering about that and the musts that sit beneath that. Get a team together, get a plan and a timetable. It's not all about the consents. I know that bothers you, but it isn't all about that. There are other aspects that you're going to need to think about, such as getting your documentation in order, your policies and your schedules, especially with regard to employee data. And if you've done all of that, go and have a lie down, because I think next step is compliance.